something that I think is at the back of lots of people's minds at the moment, both on the left and increasingly on the right. A sense we somehow missed out by not having a revolution, or at least not having a revolution that we persevered with. I think this is a profound and terrible error. If you look at France, the French monarchy, you see, is a modernizing monarchy. The French monarchy, unlike the English monarchy, gets rid of all representative assemblies at national level. And instead, it operates exactly what your Gen Z wants. It becomes a monarchical dictatorship.
Yeah. Which is why it broke.
Which is why it breaks absolutely. Yeah. And with the absolute break of the French Revolution, look at what you've had. 5 republics, 2 empires and 2 monarchies, and the 5th republic is clearly coming apart even as we speak.
Welcome to Outpost. I'm James Glancy. Now, you may have noticed that if you live in Britain, it feels like our country is in a terminal state of decline. Whether it's overtaxation, regulation, mass migration, or even getting potholes fixed in the roads, nothing seems to work. And a recent poll of Gen Z suggests that over 50% of them would prefer us to be a dictatorship. It just goes to show the extent to which people have lost faith in government and in our constitution. Now today, I have an esteemed guest with me, Dr. David Starkey, and we're going to discuss if it's possible to reset Britain. Thank you very much, David, for joining us.
A pleasure. Well, I can hardly say a pleasure after that deeply grim introduction, can I? It's our job to try to put things right.
And I'm sorry to be so negative, but it is all around us in the press. Now, what I wanted to do is really understand how government works and go back to our unwritten constitution, because it seems like a lot of us, and myself included, don't really have a deep knowledge of how Britain functions and how our constitution functions. And my understanding of Britain's unwritten constitution is that the story begins in 1215 with the Magna Carta.
Well, sort of. I mean, the story of, by the way, it's a story of England. Can we be quite clear? The constitution we're going to be talking about is the English constitution, which is then expanded with the Act of Union of 1707 to include Scotland. So we create this extraordinary, very difficult to handle, but immensely creative hybrid called the United Kingdom. But let's just park that.
It's a
very important part of the story, but let's just park it for the moment. Now, much older than Magna Carta is the body that was modified by Magna Carta. The reason you have Magna Carta is because you had an aggressive and overweening monarch, King John. The foundation of England is the monarchy and the church. Now, again, we'll try and, I think, limit talking about the church, but let's begin with the idea of monarchy. England, you're talking about dictatorship. The core of our country is the rule of one man. It was one man. The idea of a woman only really comes in, bizarrely enough, with Henry VIII, although he tears England apart to get a son. He also legitimates the rule of women because he had 2 daughters as well, and quite wisely realised that perhaps leaving everything to a little 6-year-old boy wasn't going to work. But essentially the rule of one man. Now, that is semi-dictatorial. On the other hand, of course, there's a great difference between a dictator and a monarch. A monarch is essentially bound by law. A monarch is also created in the world that we are talking about by the church. He is crowned. Now, we've seen a coronation. We saw King Charles with the rod, with the wonderful crown, the orb, and the whatever. But the thing that's most important about the coronation, though I think it was badly played down in this coronation, is the coronation oath. The difference between a dictator, it just comes from the Latin, to command, mere command. The difference with a monarch is contractual under law. He swears, and this goes right back to the Anglo-Saxon period, before the Norman conquest of 1066, the monarch swears a double oath. He swears an oath to God and to the church, and he swears an oath to his people to govern them according to right and according to law. The question is, we all go wrong. We all make mistakes. If you've got a crown on your head, if you've got an imperial robe, if you've got lots of troops around you, the tendency is, I want everything. So you need institutions. What happens is, right back again to the world of the Anglo-Saxons, you had a very powerful set of institutions. The peculiarity of the monarchy as it's created under Alfred, the only one of our monarchs who's actually called the Great, is it's a monarchy which is also powerfully rooted in the people and communal institutions. He creates the counties of England, which themselves are semi-self-governing, raise troops, which of course respond to the orders of the king if he's a strong and competent king. He has a council, a body of advisors and so on. There is an aristocracy and all the rest of it. But what you see from 1066 and onwards, from the Norman conquest onwards, is the monarch becomes much more powerful. He's conquered. That means he's absolute master. William the Conqueror is the absolute master of England. This is the law of war, not the modern wishy-washy law of war. It's the real law of war. If you conquer, the population is absolutely at your mercy. Nevertheless, William deliberately undergoes coronation, and he is the first king to be crowned in Westminster Abbey, and he swears those oaths. And you see from that point onwards this tension between the power of the monarch and the need to limit him. And to cut a very, very long story short, at Runnymede in 1215, what you do, faced with a king who had exploited law, who had torn up agreements, had been brutally oppressive, had really acted as a kind of pillager of his kingdom, had also hugely lost in war. You create, or seek to create, machinery to limit him. And you create, to begin with, very, very tightly limiting machinery. And if Magna Carta, again, we need to be quite clear on this, if the Magna Carta of 1215 had survived, our monarch would have been, the king would merely have been a nominal figure. He would have been like the Doge of Venice. He would have been in the grip of a highly powerful aristocracy, because what the Magna Carta of 1215 creates is a committee of public safety. Believe it or not, in 1215, everybody was required to swear an oath, not the basic oath of allegiance to the king, but an oath to the Committee of the Barons. It's a quasi-republic. They are entitled to exempt people from their allegiance to the king. They're entitled, if he doesn't follow their instructions, to order people against their allegiance to attack him. Now, that would have created disaster.
So that's the first draft.
That's the first draft, 1215.
So that's very radical.
Very radical. And then, fortunately, John dies. Famously in the wash, losing, which is not a kind of rotating machine. It's the marshy land between East Anglia and Lincolnshire. Yeah, he dies trying to cross that, and he's succeeded by a little boy, by his son Henry III, and that's the key to everything going right. Because whilst all this was going on, you'd had a French invasion, which sort of tends to pull people together. Many of the nobles supported the invading king. The key figure who doesn't is a man called William the Marshal, Earl of Pembroke. And he acts, you see, again, if you look at 1215, the way it's conventionally presented, this is something very radical. We're limiting the power of the king. Isn't that a very good thing? Well, yes, but it went too far. It was too radical. It was too revolutionary. William the Marshal comes along, and he is our first genuine, we are conservatives, he's our first genuinely conservative statesman. And he has a stroke of genius. Prince Louis, although he claimed to be acting on behalf of the barons, hadn't sworn to the charter. So what does William the Marshal do? He has the little boy crowned, endorsed by papal authority, but immediately after his coronation, which has to take place in Gloucester because the barons and Louis actually control London and Westminster, the first thing he does, so English, he reissues the charter. But he leaves out all the Republican clauses. And with the rest of them, you don't just say, oh, we're not going to do this. That would have been too risky. The sign that it's really English, he sets up a committee to consider all the excluded clauses, which just die quietly in the woodwork. So what you've done at that point, you've set up the good bits of Magna Carta, the promises about justice and the promises about responsible government. They're all there, but you leave the power of the king intact. And then there are a whole series of further readjustments to the charter, including what I think is the most important one in 1225, when the charter is reissued for the umpteenth time, but in a very special circumstances. It's reissued in response to a grant of taxation to which everybody contributes. In other words, for the first time, we're seeing the idea of the redress of grievance. We're seeing the idea of a charter which isn't just given to the feudal elite, which isn't just given to the important citizens in the towns, but is given to everybody in return for money. And from that point onwards, you get that idea of a body that has obviously got to agree to give money turns into, well, the thing that we call Parliament.
So can I ask that? Clearly, William Marshal is one of the most pivotal figures.
He's also good at fighting. This is something else we need to remember. He is the key figure in the creation of the medieval England. Everybody goes on about modernity as though it was a good thing. So much of and the Middle Ages are sort of bad and benighted. This gets it absolutely wrong. The structure that we've described just now, in which you have a powerful and authoritative and successful king, if he's a good king, all the good kings of the Middle Ages are like you, they're fighters. And again, one of the things we've forgotten, and this is something very important when we look at our present discontents, the freedoms of England are very much associated with England as a warrior conquering people. The reason that the great kings were so keen to consult with Parliament, they want to raise taxation to pay for their wars. So fighting and being a man and being all the things I'm not, and doing all that kind of thing is absolutely central to the idea of medieval kingship. Kings were helped by people like me, the brilliant, the clever, the academic, and the boys in the back room, but the front man had to have that ability, that forceful ability. But let's just go back to the medieval.
But I think the point I was going to say is, had he not identified that Louis hadn't taken the oath, history could have taken an incredibly different course in England.
Totally.
And secondly, he really is a pivotal figure in creating the constitutional monarchy and creating the start of our unwritten constitution.
Yes, that's right. But again, let's get this right. What we're talking about now is the idea of limited monarchy with representation. Now, that is not a modern idea. It's a medieval idea. Look at the building that still represents the best of Britain, or should represent the best of Britain. It's now tarnished and itself falling down and crumbling and leaking, and nasty sewers and horrid smells and asbestos and whatever. In other words, a symbol of everything you were talking about.
So you're talking about Parliament, Westminster.
I'm talking about what we miscall the Houses of Parliament, and is in fact the Palace of Westminster. That is a building largely rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1834, but deliberately rebuilt in a medieval style. Because our freedoms are not the result of a modern revolution. They're not the result of a written constitution extorted from a government. They're not the result of the overthrowing of a government. They're a process deeply entrenched over literally 800 years. They're organic. They're I am no climate activist, but they're organic. They're rooted in the soil. They're fertilized by our past, by the experience of people like William the Martyr.
Which is really important, because a lot of people, especially on the left, especially human rights lawyers, believe that they need to be enshrined in a Human Rights Act. Now, that's not something I want to come on to now. I want to canter through, exactly as you identified there, our unwritten constitution that has been written through 800 years.
It takes a bit of time.
Yeah.
The idea of Parliament itself, we've talked about the Charter, we've talked about bodies that discuss it, we've talked about sort of representative bodies, in other words, noblemen, representatives of the towns and knights of the shire and whatever, that grant the taxation of 1225. What you see is following that when Henry III grows up, he turns out to be almost as awful a king as his father, in the sense of being incompetent. He's haphazardly tyrannical, as opposed to John's highly effective and brutal tyranny. But it's a period in which there is immense political tension and struggles. And the nature of those struggles essentially is, shall we restore the clauses of Magna Carta that would have turned England into an aristocratic republic? That's not the sort of republic we think of, but it's a republic like the Republic of Venice or the Kingdom of Poland, in which there is a class of rich landowners who run the show collectively amongst themselves. And the key figure is a man called Simon de Montfort, who is related by blood to the monarchy, by marriage, and so on. And there is a struggle between him pushing that idea and the son of the king, the Lord Edward. They're not yet called Prince, the Lord Edward, fighting for the power of the king. And there are the so-called Barons' Wars of the middle of the 13th century. But the outcome of that is the defeat, the final shattering defeat of Simon de Montfort, who is treated as we do enemies in those days. He's cut up in four and his bits are exhibited, and the usual horror of that sort of thing. But curiously, the Lord Edward, the man who has triumphed, is the key figure in the shaping of Parliament. But he creates a Parliament, and again, it's really important we understand this. The judges, back when we had, if you remember, in 2019, the dispute between Boris Johnson and the Supreme Court, the judges come up with this, who should know better, this absurd formula. The key role of Parliament is to hold the government to account. In other words, it's to be a block on the operations of government. That showed that they needed me. They needed this lesson, because the great figure who actually creates Parliament is the Lord Edward. When he's King Edward I, and he creates Parliament to advance the powers of the monarchy. Because he's shrewd and intelligent, he realizes one very fundamental thing, which, for example, is not entirely clear that today's would-be dictator, Donald Trump, quite understands. It's quite a good idea, if you want to do something, to get people to agree to it first. In other words, Edward is the forefather of Parliament. It's under Edward that Parliament turns from this occasional series of consultative assemblies into a more or less fixed body with known membership and known methods of recruiting it. In other words, you have the upper house, what we still call the House of Lords, which in those days are the great bishops, because they're enormously rich and they are the great landowners, and the title peerage. In those days, there are only two two ranks. There are the barons and the earls, and that's the upper house. And then the lower house are representatives of the towns and the counties, the so-called House of Commons. But what he does, he creates Parliament because he wants to do two things. He wants to conquer Wales and he wants to conquer Scotland, and he wants to impose law on both of them.
And what dates are we looking at here?
We're looking at the 1260s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 1300.
But this is a process. There's nothing in statute. There's no particular.
Yeah, well, there are things called the model parliament. What happens, you see, is from this point onwards, the records of each parliament are available. The acts of the parliament are enrolled, and processes of memory build up. Because remember, this is we don't think of this. This is highly sophisticated government. Again, the most surprising people contribute to it. John, who is this king who outraged everybody because, he treats the role of monarch. He's a mafia boss, and he uses all the techniques of a mafia boss, extortion, torture, sudden death, bribery, the whole lot. But you know what? He's a brilliant record keeper, and he sets up a tradition of extraordinary record keeping. Before that, you've had the father of King John, Henry II, the first ruler of the so-called Angevin dynasty. He's a great lawgiver. You've already set up most of the machinery of common law, but Parliament itself develops records. The King's Council develop records. The King's government keeps record, the Chancery. So you've got this vital thing. You've got institutional memory. Already at this point, Parliament has got two essential functions. It is responsible for giving the king taxation. The English king, and it's really important we understand these rights, okay? Parliament has a monopoly over the legitimate grant of taxation. That is utterly central. It means the King of England cannot simply seize people's property. This is already alongside the highly developed legal system, which you've already got from the reign of Henry II onwards, with known law courts, and in fact, English law is already so sophisticated that it's got a structure of reasoning and argument that consciously bears comparison to Roman law, which is already over 1,000 years old. It develops astonishingly quickly, but you get one thing then developing, the idea of a fixed rule of law with properly appointed judges, with a system of legal training. They don't go to Oxford and Cambridge. There are separate legal training colleges which develop in London, which are called the Inns of Court, which are still there. So you've got one, and this is really important, James, one of the great anchors of you wanting to use the word modern. A modern prosperous economy is a known system of law, right, which operates largely independently of governmental interference. Right, you had that. Once also you set up the idea that you can only tax with consent, you then further secure property right. So you have a known system of law and you have secure property right. These are two of the absolute fundamentals that lay the foundation of a proper capitalist economy. And then the final one is you set up a machinery by which law at a high level, and often quite a low level, is modified by consent. In other words, by a vote in Parliament. Now, this establishes the final pillar of all of this. So you've got a known system of law, you've got secure property right, you've got exemption from arbitrary confiscation of property. But the final thing that's really important about this parliamentary system is the idea of representation. The idea, what is it that makes a country legitimate? And this is the issue that you raised. People now feel that our country isn't legitimate, that it doesn't impose that sense of obligation. They'd like to sweep it away and impose something else. Already by the beginning of the 14th century, by the 1300s, the judges are absolutely clear. Everybody in England is bound by what is decided in Parliament, by an act of Parliament, because everybody is represented there.
But who sits in, who are these people, and how do they get there?
How do they get there in exactly the same way that they get there now? The upper House of Lords is essentially, as I said, it's the great accumulation of landed wealth and people that the king elevates to it in the same way, effectively, that the Prime Minister does now, and with, of course, this enormously important role of the Church, which is a kind of separate, parallel structure of power. But the lower house is elected. There are elections held in the counties and elections held in the towns. Now, again, by no means everybody is entitled to vote, but in some areas, very high.
What is the franchise qualification?
It's immensely complex. It varies. There's a more or less a single franchise in the counties. Each town will have its own rules. Some are virtually very close to male. Of course, only men participate. Female franchise doesn't come to the beginning of the 20th century, but in some towns, very high percentage of the male population will be involved. In others, it's only a fragment. But there is still, despite all these eccentricities, despite the fact that some boroughs are very large and some boroughs are very small, there's still a clear sense of representation. And this is something which is established hundreds, 600-700 years ago. And this idea is the bedrock of England. And it's the thing until very recently that distinguished us. It's why the Constitution, I wanted to go on. I've been holding you back on all of this because everything that happens afterwards depends on these foundations. And it depends on the fact that generation after generation after that decided it wouldn't demolish it completely. However much it needed to change, however much it needed to modify, it would still keep that basic structure. And the other thing that's even more important, that basic structure was reformable. It was sufficiently, the idea of representation, the sense of legitimacy, both of the monarchy and of Parliament and the bodies involved in it, was sufficiently strong, was sufficiently well rooted that they could reform without it being destroyed.
So that's a really important
point. It is
point.
Utterly crucial.
It's crucial because there is a sense that we have a straitjacket on the way government is done, and we're not reformable. And whoever you put into government today is constrained. Now, I don't want to canter all the way forwards to 1997 beyond, but essentially that the high watermark.
I think what happened is that a system which retains an extraordinary degree of flexibility. And remember, there is something quite something that I think is at the back of lots of people's minds at the moment, both on the left and increasingly on the right, a sense we somehow missed out by not having a revolution, or at least not having a revolution that we persevered with. I think this is a profound and terrible error. If you look at France, now this really is leaping ahead, their monarchy, which to begin with developed in a very similar way to ours, and indeed ours was, remember, we were in many ways a French satellite, or we were culturally a French satellite. The people who conquer England, the Normans who conquer England in 1066 are French speaking. Our language is an amalgam of the native Anglo-Saxon with French, which of course does derive from Latin, and it's then further modified in the 16th and 17th century with direct additions from Latin and Greek, and the extraordinary transformation. Again, just so that everybody understands this, English, I've been arguing that England is a very old country in terms of the continuity of its institutions. What is very striking in terms of its language, English is a very recent language. English in a recognizable form only goes back to the end of the 14th century. It only goes back to 1399, and it's invented really by one man.
I think if you're listening from America, that might seem quite old in
But
comparison.
sorry, but if you
history.
right, let me give you an illustration. If you look at the Battle of Hastings,
Hmm.
the Norman knights at Hastings are already speaking a language which a modern Frenchman can understand. That is not true of the Anglo-Saxon housecarls of Harold. To give you, there are one or two things about them you can understand.
Yeah.
You're a military chap. Would you like to know what the war cry of the housecarls, that's the equivalent of the household troops of King Harold, was?
Of King Harold.
Harold.
Harold, yeah, of course.
King Harold, who was killed by King William. What is their
What
war
was it?
cry?
You told me.
Oot, 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 out, out, out.
Out, yeah.
It's like Arthur Scargill and his miners.
Sounds Scottish.
Well, no, the miners weren't Scottish. It's out, out, out. Good northern stuff. So English then is a language of recent formation, and what it does in the 16th century, it adds all of these abstract nouns. The peculiarity of English, again, is its astonishing flexibility. So we've got then both a constitution and a language with astonishing flexibility. The French monarchy, you see, is a modernizing monarchy. The French monarchy, unlike the English monarchy, gets rid of all representative assemblies at national level. It keeps them at local level, at the level of provinces and whatever, though they're heavily manipulated. And instead, it operates exactly what your Gen Z wants. It becomes a monarchical dictatorship. Driven by the power of the king. If you go to Versailles and you actually look up at the ceiling of the famous Galerie des Glaces, you'll see inscribed there in all the swirling colour and gilt and elaborate plasterwork, you'll see these what are actually slogans. Le roi gouverne par lui-même. The king rules by himself. But you see, that system was not capable of modernization, or rather, it was not capable of responding to criticism.
Which is why it broke in 1789.
Which is why it breaks absolutely.
Yeah.
And with the absolute break of the French Revolution, look at what you've had. 5 republics, 2 empires and 2 monarchies, and the 5th republic is clearly coming apart even as we speak. Right, let's go back.
I mean, that's what's critical here, is there have been points in English
where we did have a
British
revolution.
history,
Yeah.
or not just a revolution, but the country has come to a point where there needs to be a new set of regulation, or a new set of legislation to change the way the executive or the legislative functions, because it's not fit for purpose. And at the beginning, I said I feel like we are approaching one of those, but I'd like to come back to the significant modifications that are the basis of our constitution, which is why I want to discuss the 1832. It's why I want to discuss the Parliament Act and the Bill of Rights, because
and why you need to go back even further. You see, no. So again, what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to give you a dynamic.
Yes.
I'm trying to give you a dynamic which explains where we are now, what the foundations are, what the weaknesses are, what the developmental points are. So let's just look at this structure that I've given you. That pattern of a monarchy, an hereditary monarchy with a 2-chamber parliament, remains the basis of our government from the reign of Edward I right through to now. Now, clearly, the essential tension within it is, where does the power lie? Does it lie with the king as a personal will? Or does it lie with the machine as a whole? So, where the king, of course, all things like both houses of parliament, the law courts, the administrative institutions that all develop in the Palace of Westminster, they all operate in the name of the king. It's why we have King's Bench. Or used to have, I think we may even have eliminated it with the unfortunate reforms of the legal system that we've recently carried out. But if you look at even the Commons, the centre of, as it were, alternative power to the king, over the Speaker's chair there is the royal arms. In the House of Lords there is the huge throne, and all government departments use the royal arms. In other words, we've got two sorts of royal power. There's the power in the Middle Ages and right up to the 18th century, the power of the king as an actual will, that le roi gouverne par lui-même. But there's also another idea, the idea that the king is not so much an individual will, he is government by rules. And there are these two ideas of government by the king and government under the king. And these two ideas are in profound, they're in a dynamic relationship with each other. And when the thing works, the two of them dovetail with each other. When monarchs become either too weak or too aggressive, it topples over. And what you can see, I think, is the repeated struggles in the Middle Ages, usually because monarchs are actually feeble. It's feeble monarchs who bring this structure down, feeble and childishly aggressive, or even just feeble monarchs who bring it down. And then the great turning point, the moment at which, again, is one of the great you're wanting these senses of sort of hinges in English history, is the Reformation, the reign that I've devoted most of my life to studying, the reign of Henry VIII, in which we see this relationship between government by the king and government under the king undergo a really very, very dramatic shift. Because thanks to Henry VIII, thanks to Thomas Cromwell, thanks to Henry's need to break with Rome so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. Again, you see, we've been talking about these in big abstract terms. Very often, the most important changes are driven by relatively trivial things. Small things can bring about enormous changes. But in the reign of Henry VIII, both of these ideas, that's to say, both the government of the king as an individual and a person, and government by the institutions of state, government under the king, both develop intensely. And they even acquire separate palaces. So the king gets a new palace called the Palace of Whitehall, and the Parliament remains in the old royal palace, the Palace of Westminster. But the king is, of course, enormously strengthened by the clash with Rome, because he takes control of the church, of the wealth of the church. He develops, thanks to the work of people like Thomas Cromwell, new powerful institutions of government like the Privy Council, like the Secretaryship. Because remember, this is the moment at which writing ceases to be by hand and becomes by print. So it's again very much like our age. It's an age of media revolution. And that media revolution does two things. It enormously strengthens the power of the king and his direct ability to rule. There's been no more aggressively powerful king than Henry VIII. But on the other hand, it also, because the body that agrees that the king shall, in fact, I call it the first Brexit, that the king shall break with Rome, is Parliament. It's done through, Henry VIII he carries out a revolution, but he carries out a revolution legally, using the existing machinery of law and Parliament. So that again becomes immensely strengthened. And what you do then is you can see from that point onwards that the drama of the tension between rule by the king and rule under the king becomes acute. And you get there's also the tensions of a monarch who assumes religious power at a time when there's profound dispute as to what is, not simply whether it's Catholic or Protestant, but above all, what sort of Protestant it is. And all of that with a new dynasty, with the Stuarts coming in at the beginning of the 17th century, when the line of the Tudors die out. The Stuarts inherit a monarchy of Scotland in which the theoretical power, though not the practical power of the king, is very, very much more powerful, is very much more extreme, very much more unrooted. And James I and Charles I do actually believe in absolute royal power.
And this is what heads towards
and
revolution.
that leads to our one true revolution,
Yeah.
the revolution of the 1640s, and of course to the fact that we are, as always, first. We are the first country publicly to put a monarch on trial for treason against his people and to cut his head off. We don't do it in the squalid way that the French do. It's done with according him personal dignity and whatever, but we do abolish the monarchy, and we do what even the French didn't succeed in doing: destroy every element they could get their hands on of the medieval monarchy.
So it's during the Restoration,
Yes.
after Cromwell, that we then move to constrain the monarchy.
Well, what happens is, again, we do have, I want to talk about your chaps who want a dictatorship.
Yes.
That's exactly what we got once you cut Charles's head off. You have an aggressive military dictatorship.
The Protector.
And the Lord Protector. And Cromwell is arguably our most effective ruler. He is the only person who conquers the whole of the British Isles, famously in Ireland with horrible methods. But we forget he also does it in Scotland. Not even the greatest of the medieval kings, not Edward I could do it. Not Henry VIII could do it.
Nor the Romans.
But nor the Romans. But Cromwell does. He makes England the most feared power of Northern Europe. Again, the enormous expansion of the navy and so on. But it is done at a terrible cost.
And I suppose a lot of people won't recognise that it's that period that leads to things like the Troubles in Ireland.
Directly.
And it has led to that sense of Scottish-English animosity.
I don't think Scottish and English. No, it's English and Irish. That is where, I mean, it's Scotland. Sorry, it's Cromwell at Drogheda and whatever. I mean, an actual massacre.
But there's still brutality.
I said it's an actual massacre.
Yeah.
He carries out, and that is, you mentioned the word Cromwell to most Irishmen. Indeed. I mean, I've friends who still argue, Irish friends who argue passionately that there shouldn't be the statue of Cromwell in front of the Houses of Parliament. But why does this immensely powerful military dictatorship fall? Well, partly because it's been made hereditary, so it would have passed to Cromwell's son Richard, who isn't interested and isn't terribly good at it. But why is it replaced with a monarch? Because the powers of a protector were unknown and unlimited. In other words, it was a dictatorship. The powers of a monarch were known and limited in law. So you bring back Charles II in the Restoration in 1660, but you know what? The same problems continue. There isn't a resolution of this tension. Again, that we don't want to...
All because of Henry VIII.
No, I think it was always there. I mean, I argued going right. I mean, it's exacerbated under Henry, but I argued going right. But why you have Magna Carta? There is this tension between le roi gouverne par lui-même, the king wanting to do it by himself, and on the other hand, this sense, well, we've got to restrain him. He may go too far. And by the way, I'd like some share of power as well.
So what was the solution?
The solution, again, it doesn't. See, this is one of the things. It's so interesting. You're rushing all the time. The very reason that we finally get it right is people recognize it takes several bites of the cherry. So you decide very sensibly, and we've never had it since, you don't want a military dictator. And we have never again allowed direct rule by soldiers in Britain. And this again is a lesson which the Americans have also learned. And we have not allowed a politicized army, which of course developed in the Civil War. What happened then after Charles II, who was clever, and his brother James II, who was very thick, and is driven from the throne in 1688, 1689. At that point, there is an enormous strengthening of the independent authority and right of Parliament. So what you do is, why you even able to get a king to come along and serve William III? William III also does descend from the house. So we're rushing, but sorry, we need a diagram to explain all this to people. He descends from the House of Stuart on his mother's side, so he has some claim to the throne. He's also married to one of James's daughters, James II's daughters, to Mary by James II's first wife, Anne Hyde, who is a Protestant. So Mary is a Protestant, William is a Protestant, and James II had played around with Roman Catholicism, which is one of the reasons that he's driven off the throne. Anyway, what William wants is English money so that he can fight a war against Louis XIV, and that, of course, leads further to an enormous strengthening of this settlement of Parliament. It's in 1689 that the basic elements of the modern constitution are first formally sketched out. You have a clear idea that there must always be a Parliament in session. Before that point, Parliament is only huge intervals can pass between the summoning of Parliament. From 1689, there is always to be a Parliament. You make absolutely clear at this point that the king cannot use his royal prerogative simply to set law aside. That you can't use what are called the dispensing powers. And you also make clear at this point that judges have got to be appointed for life, rather than just at royal favour. And you again do something else which is strikingly important. You say that what goes on in Parliament is privileged. It's privileged in two ways. There'd been a long tradition of freedom in speech in Parliament, but it's now made inviolable. That no other court is allowed to intervene in it. You also make it clear that that no other court can actually, and this is an idea that we've in fact abandoned, that no other court can actually challenge an act of Parliament. So these central things are worked out.
So is that setting the precedent for parliamentary privilege?
It's
as we know it.
But again, once again, it is writing it in stone. The going right back to the first time we have really full records of appointment of speakers and whatever, the speaker will petition the king for freedom of speech in Parliament, and even Henry VIII, on the whole, grants it. So people in Parliament, denounce the king for marrying a whore, for marrying Anne Boleyn, and they get away with it. And remember, this is the great difference between our protection of freedom of speech in our Bill of Rights and the American protection of freedom of speech in their Bill of Rights. Our Bill of Rights only protects freedom of speech in Parliament, which it makes it absolute and inviolable. The First Amendment grants a broad protection of freedom of speech in America, which applies to everybody. It's a very important difference. But what 1689 does is enormously to strengthen the power of Parliament. All the things which had been implicit, parliamentary control over legislation, parliamentary control over taxation, the need to have a Parliament that meets frequently, because which is established in a very simple way. It's required that the funding for the army can only be voted for a year at a time. So, in other words, Parliament has to meet at least once a year. So the balance of power between the monarch and Parliament swings very firmly to Parliament. In other words, the idea of government under the king as opposed to government by the king. And it's expressed very clearly in terms of the coronation. This is the first time at which all the members of Parliament, including the House of Commons, are present at a coronation. the oath that a monarch takes, monarchs had always sworn to govern according to law. The parliamentary, as the coronation oath is rewritten, which says quite clearly, you have to govern according to the laws made in Parliament. But you know what? Even that doesn't solve the problem. There is still the tension between the person of the monarch, the personal wish, the desire, the competence of the monarch, and the and Parliament, and the evolving structure of a cabinet, of a privy council, of a cabinet council, of leading members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, who act as royal ministers and increasingly control the machinery.
But that's the
government.
function of government. But in terms of what has been written down, it really marks since 1215, the Magna Carta, one of the most important constitutional moments in British history.
As I said, what it is, it's the moment at which the balance between government by the king and government under the king swings very sharply towards government under the king. So all sorts of devices which the king had available to him are shut off. Nevertheless, the power and the driving force of government remains the king. And the solution to all of this only comes in the next generation. In the next generation, the House of Stuart dies out, and the English import a Protestant dynasty with vague descent from the House of Stuart, the House of Hanover, the German House of Hanover. And it's in the first couple of decades of the reign of the House of Hanover from 1714 onwards that you actually get the permanent solution to our politics. And it's something that most people, even I think most politicians, don't actually understand. It's this miraculous institution of the office of Prime Minister. And the office of Prime Minister, the Prime Minister is effectively a second king. And what the Prime Minister does, he has a double face. He's like a Roman god. He faces in one direction and in another direction. And in one direction, he manages the king on behalf of Parliament. And you get the development of the idea that increasingly the king can only act in his official capacity on the advice of the Prime Minister. In other words, what the king does must reflect the general sense in Parliament of what Parliament wants him to do. In other words, that Parliament starts to set the lines of policy. But at the same time, the Prime Minister also manages Parliament on behalf of the king.
So who is that first recognised Prime Minister?
Is Sir Robert Walpole in the 1720s. And again, it's really important we understand this. And the model of what's going on in France at the moment helps us to understand. As you'll have seen in France, at the moment, the structures of the Fifth Republic are collapsing.
And when we say the moment, we don't mean in the 1700s. We mean 2024.
We mean now. We mean in 2025. In 2024, the structures. 2025. As I've just celebrated my 80th birthday, I really should remember. The structures of the Fifth Republic are collapsing because the Parliament has got no means of controlling it. There is no majority within it. There is no authority in the Prime Minister to control it. There is no agreement on any form of policy, whatever. The structure is simply disintegrating. And this again is something which our Supreme Court completely failed to understand at the time when it overruled Boris Johnson and the prorogation. Just one second. Representative assemblies have to be managed. Because otherwise they just become a nuisance. You see, again, this is my great point about this potted history that we've been given. It's an intensely conservative one. If you look in the middle of the 17th century, you have this great leap forward. We go into high pressure military dictatorship, sweeping away old traditions, introducing radical radical modern methods of administration, getting rid of Latin, getting rid of Norman French and whatever. And then we pull back because it loses legitimacy. And it's like, it's this unit, it's always 2 steps forward, well, bit far perhaps. Let's pull back and make sure, A, we get it right, and B, we don't lose contact with what's been there before. But the essential thing is, and again, we've completely forgotten this, because the conventional constitutional history of Britain presents the idea of Parliament as something to which we are progressing. It's not. It's rooted right. It fundamentally has not changed until 1997. In 700 or 800 years. Everywhere else in Europe, it vanishes, because everywhere else in Europe, parliaments are just a nuisance. They block governments doing sensible things, so monarchs get rid of them. The peculiar thing about our parliament was not that it's simply an instrument of opposition, which it could be when it was necessary, but essentially it's part of the process of government. And this again is something that we've completely forgotten. Invocation of silly notions of separation of powers, the idea that the legislative, that the executive and the judiciary should be completely separate. Again, very characteristic of the Blair changes. This is a disastrous idea, and a disastrous idea particularly in Britain. How could we have had a separation of powers when the Prime Minister sits in the legislative as the chief of the executive, and he usually, because he's got a majority in the House of Commons, controls the legislative. So it is the creation of this office of Prime Minister that stabilizes the entire system. And you get at this point, James, a series of extraordinarily important developments. First of all, you actually although in theory the office of Prime Minister isn't constitutionally formulated, it is in practice by the 1730s, because you know what King George II, that's the second king of the House of Hanover, does? He actually gives the Prime Minister a town palace. We're used to thinking of Downing Street as this little kind of sort of poky terraced house. That's only the front. At the back, there is a magnificent late 17th century town palace with its own garden, grand, elegant rooms and all the rest of it. Very, if it were used properly, a not undistinguished rival to the interiors of the White House. So you, in other words,
which building is that?
Well, it is part of Downing Street. It was. I can't remember which great lady of the late 17th century it was built for, but it is a very, very elegant, very large scale late 17th century town palace. That's what it amounts to. So you as it were create a separate palace for the Prime Minister. And this is also, and there's another really...
But to recap, where we've gone from is essentially all power laying with the monarchy.
Yeah.
There's been a sense of constraint in 2015, but the real power shift doesn't really come...
I mean 1215.
What did I just say there?
You said 2015. Never mind.
Yeah.
12. Yeah.
So to recap, essentially what we're talking about is a huge shift of where power lies from the monarchy, which is constrained to some extent in 1215 under the Magna Carta. But the real shift to Parliament comes after 1689, but really with the establishment of the Prime Minister in the early 1700s.
The point I'm trying to make is it's several elements in the process, and this is why it works. You see, people didn't do as we do now and think, oh, I've got a good idea, let's try and sort it all out at once. They did one thing, then perhaps it works, perhaps it doesn't.
But is there a sense of that? Because we look at America, for example, and they established their constitution, they established their rights within that, and we look at that as a model, and that's why we try and meddle.
Well, can I explain why America... Right, there are two very important things to remember. America is the only ever successful revolution. There has never been another successful revolution. Secondly, it's a revolution because it isn't. You break with England but you keep virtually everything that mattered. Remember, America is already a highly sophisticated society. The people, the founding fathers, these are not a collection of rebellious peasants. These are mainly English gentlemen and highly learned Boston merchants. They have their own universities. The universities of North America are more ancient than any English university apart from Oxford and Cambridge. We forget this. They go back Harvard, Yale, and whatever. Go back to William and Mary. Go back to the 17th century. So these are people soaked not only in the English tradition but in the classical tradition. And moreover, the American Constitution is a very lightly modified version of the English Constitution of the 18th century, which incorporates all of these things. And I always tease my American friends, do you know what the administrative officer of the House of Representatives is called? The House of Representatives is clearly the House of Commons. It's got a speaker. The Senate is the House of Lords. There's a central lobby between the two of them. In the current building, it's called the Rotunda, where Trump was inaugurated. Yeah. But it's just like the central lobby.
So you're saying Congress is based on the structure.
So Congress is just really the Westminster Parliament. Do you know what the administrative officer of the lower house, the House of Representatives, is called? Well, Americans can't pronounce it. They say Sergeant at Arms. He's called the Sergeant at Arms because it's just borrowed from the Sergeant at Arms who fulfill the same role in the English, by this point, the British Parliament. So the American Revolution, and again, they preserve absolutely English law. All property rights. So the American Revolution is really, it's a civil war. What we forget, it's a civil war. All this nonsense of founding a new kind of nation is not true. Yes, the Declaration of Independence, with we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born free and equal, and all the rest of it. There isn't a word of that in the Constitution. In other words, there's no attempt at reconstructing the basic elements of society. And all the American states, you keep the states as they are. All the states already had legislative assemblies. You even keep the name of the quasi-monarchical figure, the governor. He'd been the royal governor. So what I think is really important to understand is that the American Revolution wasn't like the French Revolution.
No, absolutely.
It was not an attempt at scrubbing everything.
So how in Britain or in England, because at this point we've only just reached pre-1707 the Act of Union with Scotland. So this is where we're at constitutionally with the creation of Great Britain. Mm-hmm. So this all happens in a relatively condensed period of time compared to the previous few hundred years. We suddenly have the 1689 Bill of Rights, then we have 1707, the creation of Great Britain.
And the office of Prime Minister.
And the office of Prime Minister all in one go. So that is a crucial period of British history for the formation of what is our unwritten constitution.
And not only that, can we just pause something else? It is an astonishing period in world history. In this tiny stretch of time from 1689, or you could argue from 1660 to 1720, England in particular, but Britain in general, invent modernity. There is this astonishing explosion. This is the moment at which the British Empire is really invented. This is the moment at which England becomes a predominant world power. It's an astonishingly rapid change that up to 1688, England, as I said, is essentially a French satellite. The Stuarts depend heavily on the power of Louis XIV. Within the astonishingly short period from 1689, the Glorious Revolution, to 1705, the Battle of Blenheim, what is it? It's 20-odd years. In that period, England turns itself into a power that more than rivals France. And with the victory, with Marlborough's repeated victories over the French, and particularly the victory of Blenheim in 1705, Louis XIV, who had been the hegemon of Europe at that point, is brought down. The magnificent silver orange tubs of the Galerie des Glaces have got to be melted down, and the pretensions of France to world hegemony are brought low. But it's astonishing, and it's also something else. It's a vision of power which is heavily based on science, heavily based on commerce, heavily based on culture. I was talking about the Galerie des Glaces at Versailles, that simple hymn to absolute monarchy and absolute monarchical power. Well, we have an equivalent in Britain. It's the astonishing, and anybody who's interested in this should go and look at it. It's the astonishing interior of the Great Hall of the Royal Naval Hospital at Greenwich, and the interior of that hall is a magnificent interior. It's much less ostentatious in terms of its materials.
Is that where they have the big dinners?
That's right.
Yeah, I've had a few there.
Indeed. It's painted. It's called the Painted Hall. It's painted by a wonderful English painter. Nobody gets his name. He's called Sir James Thornhill. And what he does, if you look up at that ceiling, it's this new world. In the centre of the ceiling is a wonderful image of William III being borne up. It's the apotheosis of William and Mary. And what he has, he's got he's wearing armour under his robes because he's a fine soldier. And under the instep of his armour is the neck of Louis XIV being crushed by the revived power of England. But all round there are the emblems of science, of the new mathematics. Remember, this is the moment of Isaac Newton. This is the complete foundations of modern physics are laid in a tiny, tiny period of time. Again, England and France differing absolutely radically in scientific method. France is this monarchy of top-down. It's deductive power. And the model of reasoning in France is Descartes, high deductive reasoning. Again, you get Louis XIV using Versailles, trying to control and shape all French culture with the various royal academies.
Sounds like the European Union.
It is, which is the model. In England, you have something completely different. It's inductive. It comes up. It's historically determined. And of course, that is the way that this, not only is that, this again is something we forget. The scientific method depends on evidence. It depends on what another great Englishman had the terrible phrase, putting nature to the torture, putting nature to the question. It experimental evidence, the evidence of things you can observe. The apple, the alleged apple falling on Newton's head, his use of the prism.
So where we are now really is the start of the Great British story.
It's a great British story. But what it is, it's really important we understand. We tend to think of it as just as an explosion of military power. What it is something wildly different. It's military, it's financial, it's intellectual, it's commercial, it's cultural. It's this utterly it's a moment again of extraordinary national efflorescence, and it creates something, it seems to me, to be absolutely fundamental. It's also tied to specific events, to the Glorious Revolution, and again to the accession of the House of Hanover, and the way Thornhill represents this. The main structure of the hall is William and Mary, and then the dais is the accession of the House of Hanover, and again the whole thing emblematically treated. And what I think we should do, dare I say, we should stop there.
I was going to say I hadn't quite appreciated the complexity of the evolution of the Constitution.
But isn't it exciting?
It is really exciting, and the fact is that unless you have read history in this way, it's very easy to look at it as a series of dates, 12, 15,
and
16,
progress.
18.
And it's not simple
and it's much more of rolling developments. And I think it does nicely segue for a part two, because there is a lot more to discuss as we come all the way up to 1997 and then to 2025. But essentially finishing off on that 1707, that's right, Act of Union.
It's the Act of Union. And interestingly
we are
enough,
no longer England, run by the English Parliament. We are Great Britain of England and Scotland.
Indeed. But it is still that old parliamentary structure. All you do, and again, let's just finish on this note so we get this absolute right. The Union of England and Scotland is the most, I think, generous union of two very widely different sized countries. England is already 7-8 million. Scotland is probably only 500,000. Quite extraordinary disproportion. And yet the union of the two of them is done with extraordinary tact. The monarchy is fused, so there had been a single monarch since 1604. On the other hand, there had been an entirely separate identity of the Kingdom of Scotland. Now that so much of that is still preserved. There is no longer a Scottish coronation. The honours of Scotland are actually lost and mislaid. But on the other hand, Scotland preserves an extraordinary sense of separateness, and it's important we understand this. Again, so what you do is you've got a common king of Great Britain, as it's called, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and you also you abolish the Scottish Parliament, because Scotland had a parliament. You abolish the Scottish Parliament and you give Scotland an over-representation in terms of both its population and wealth in the English Parliament. But the history of English law, the history of the English Parliament and whatever, is not broken. In that sense, union does not represent a disruption of the story I'm telling. But the thing that's important, bearing in mind particularly the silly arguments of Scottish nationalists, that it's an act of colonisation. The Scotland of 1707, apart from the monarchy and apart from the Parliament, retains all the lineaments of separate nationhood. It retains its own distinct system of law. It retains its own version of the Protestant religion, to the extent which the monarch actually changes religion when they go north of the border. They become a Scots Presbyterian. It retains its own completely separate educational system with its own universities, and whose rights and existence is actually entrenched in the Act of Union. It retains even its own heraldry. It retains its own peerage. Everything.
So what you're saying is essentially it's a very good deal for Scotland.
It's a very, very good deal
at the time, and it probably strikes me that it would make sense to do a history of devolution and the history of the Union.
That is absolutely right. And there's another reason, of course. The Scots had a powerful interest, both countries had a powerful interest in union. It is the sense that there was the risk of French intervention in Scotland. There are two things that unite. One of them unites both of them, and one unites and disunites. It is, again, we've deliberately left religion out. The England and Scotland, the elites of both countries, are passionately Protestant and profoundly anti-Catholic. France is identified with Catholicism and absolutism, and they see their union as protecting them against that. And then finally, there's something else. I referred to the astonishing expansion of England overseas, the creation of the English Empire. The Scots were ever so jealous, and they tried to create their own empire in the Isthmus of Panama, the so-called Darien scheme. It had been a catastrophic failure, and Scotland was virtually bankrupt. And part of the deal of 1707 was that the Scots got access to the British Empire, and they thereupon become the most effective, and some would say the most brutal, of the colonizers of empire. And so many of the great institutions of empire are run by Scots. Scottish banking runs Canada. Their enormous importance in India, in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and so on. All of that extraordinary role of Scotland. And again, of course, the spreading forces of
Modern Scotland is built on the back of the 1707.
It is
Well,
absolutely built on
that concludes part one, and I'm very much looking forward to a part two where we're coming rapidly towards
modernity.
20th century and modernity.